Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to this week's Q&A. Last time, I challenged you guys to see if you could come up with some extra interesting questions, and I'd say, yeah, you guys did a pretty good job. More questions than usual, and I would say overall, more interesting questions than usual for sure. So thank you guys so much for living up to my expectations. And so more than ever, if your question doesn't get answered in this video, then please go ahead and copy and paste it onto the bottom of this Patreon post, in addition to posting any new questions you have, because I think there's still a lot of interesting questions that I'm not going to be able to get to today just because of time limitations. So with that said, also I should probably just touch on that, although the world's going crazy right now with the coronavirus epidemic, so far I'm totally fine. I'm just here in my apartment with my brother, trying to avoid leaving our house as much as possible. And overall, it hasn't actually affected my day-to-day life too much because I already worked from home and spent most of my life in my room anyway. And so as long as there's internet connection, things are pretty good. So I'm staying safe. Hopefully all of you guys are staying safe as well. And hopefully you guys are using this opportunity to get some extra immersion in, because it's pretty much the ultimate opportunity to really go hard on mass immersion. Although I also know it can be pretty difficult to really buckle down and focus on something when you actually have so much free time and you're spending so much time in one place. I know you can go a little crazy. It can actually be more difficult to focus, even though it seems like it would be the perfect opportunity. So don't beat yourself up if you're not immersing as much as you feel like maybe you should, but just try to improve a little bit every day. But I think there's actually a question related to this, so I'll go more into that when we get there. So now let's actually jump in. So Tops Down asks, "Hi Matt, it seems like you and Yoga are focusing your efforts on Anki optimizations. When do you think stages 3 through 5 will be available? Would you be willing to post stripped down versions for people currently in those stages? Even just the at a glance sections would be helpful." So yeah, we have been largely working on the Anki optimizations, but we also have been working on the overall MI site. As you guys maybe have noticed, the site looks pretty different now, but the current site that's up at the time of this recording is also just a temporary kind of placeholder site. We're working on a total redesign right now, which should be coming out within the next month or two. And after that, we're going to put more effort towards creating the actual MIA content. We're actually in the process of completely reformulating how we're going to structure the MIA theory content and instructional content. But it is something that now we're starting to focus more of our efforts towards. So there should be more of the higher stage content coming out within the next few months, hopefully. But in the meantime, there kind of already is a stripped down version of the stages in the form of the overview, right? So if you go to the MIA website and you click on stage 0, there's an overview that tells you what every stage consists of, like literally all the different techniques and exercises that you're going to be applying in that stage. And if you go through all the content on the Matt vs. Japan YouTube channel and all of the past Q&A content, and I'll just give a reminder here that if you go to the MIA website, you can go to the archive, the Patreon Q&A archive page, and find all the questions with timestamps for everything I've ever answered in these Patreon Q&As. And so if you combine those with the Matt vs. Japan YouTube channel, you should be able to find plenty of information on any specific technique that you want to learn more about within the overview. So if you're basically think that you're in stage 4, then just go look at the outline, see the contents of stage 4, and then just start doing that. And if you don't know what any of the specific contents are, then check the main YouTube channel, check the Patreon Q&As, and if you still need extra clarification on something, then ask in the server. You can DM me on any of the platforms that I'm on, or ask on the current week's Patreon Q&A so I can answer it in the next one, and I think you should be fine. So in the meantime, I still think that if you really put in the effort, you can still execute the higher MIA stages with the information available at the present moment. But yeah, we're also planning on fleshing out the rest of the stages in the relatively near future. So Renfrid asks, "I haven't seen visual novels discussed or recommended much when it comes to reading immersion. I find them to be the most engaging form of text-based media for me so far, especially when using text hooking to copy sentences into Anki. Do you have any experience with them, and would you recommend them? Do you have any specific favorites you would suggest? The main downside so far has been finding ones that aren't region locked to a Japanese OS and at a suitable level around stage 2. Yeah, so for anyone who doesn't know, visual novels are this form of Japanese media where it's basically a computer game that is largely just text. So it's like a video game, but you play it on your computer. You can also get it on other systems like PSP or other, like maybe PS3 or something. I don't know, depending on what the game is. But I think traditionally you play them on your computer, and it will have like a very basic picture, which is like the background of that scene, which has like a picture of the characters in it. And then maybe sometimes there's a little bit of voice acting. There's also background music. But for the most part, the entire game consists of text. So there might be a paragraph of text on the screen. You read it, you click next. The next paragraph comes up. And then every once in a while, you're presented with options. So you get to kind of pick your own story, like those pick your own story books. And so each visual novel will have multiple different endings. And which ending you arrive at depends on the series of decisions you make throughout the story. And so people who want to like full complete a visual novel go through and play it multiple times and play through every single scenario and try out every single option and things like that, if you're like a hardcore nerd who wants to go really deep on these things. And a lot of anime are based off visual novels like Clannad and Little Busters and Steins Gate and Fate Stay Night are all based off visual novels. So they're pretty heavily rooted in anime culture, otaku culture, and that's kind of the background of them. So yeah, I've had experience in playing visual novels when I was more of an otaku in my kind of AJAT golden days, maybe you'd say. I tried out a lot of visual novels. I liked a lot of the key anime. Like, I liked a lot of the anime that was based off of key visual novels. Key, like Key, is a brand that makes visual novels, and they made like Clannad, Air, what are the other ones? Angel Beats and a bunch of other ones. And so I liked those anime a lot, so I'd play the visual novels, but I would always get bored of them, because the thing with visual novels are that they're very long and drawn out. You know, sometimes the plots unfold very slowly. It's kind of like you're living the life of the main character, and it goes into a lot of detail. Like, okay, today we're going to school again, and today in school this happened. The teacher said this. I had this conversation with the student next to me, and they're normally played in the first person. And so you're really just kind of living the life of the main character and trying to really put yourself in the shoes of the main character. And so some people just really like this, and they like how immersive and comprehensive the experience is. For me, it would be cool for a little while, and then I'd just get super bored and want to really just start doing something else and get totally bored with the story far before I would get to the end. Like, I'd get like 1/4 of the way through the story, and it would just be like, God, I'm so bored of this. I cannot take this anymore. And then I'd go and watch a different show or read a different book, and then I'd end up never coming back, basically. So my experience was that they just didn't really fit me personally as a medium, but they definitely were pretty ideal reading practice, because in terms of difficulty, I would say it's definitely harder than a manga, but in general, easier than a light novel. Now, there's a big range, so there are visual novels that are more difficult than most light novels and most normal novels and stuff like that. There's some that are crazy difficult. But in general, I would say most of them are easier than light novels, and so it's a really good way to transition from reading something like a manga to a more fully text-based medium. And of course, there's voice acting a lot of the time for some of the lines, so you get to hear some stuff spoken. And also there's this program called the Text Hooker, which basically lets you, in short, like to simplify what's really going on, it lets you copy and paste the text so that you can easily look things up with Yomi-chan and easily make Anki cards. So of course, this is really ideal for learning Japanese, because you can take advantage of all the Anki and other software tools that are available to Japanese learners. So in that sense, it is pretty ideal for learning. The only drawback being a lot of people are probably going to find them boring. Like, if you can't get into anime culture, like the kind of otaku like meta narrative and all this stuff, like it has all the tropes of anime characters. And, anime characters generally don't reflect real life human beings very often. And so for me, as a 25-year-old, this makes it harder for me to really relate to the characters and get into the storylines of anime and some manga and visual novels and stuff. So I know a lot of people are just like me in that regard, and they're not going to be able to get into visual novels. They're going to find it too off-putting, the way that the characters and the stories are presented. But if you don't experience that, and you are kind of an otaku type of fellow, and you like that stuff, then yeah, it can be really ideal reading practice. Eventually, you'll probably get to the point where visual novels are pretty easy, and you might want to move on to more like actual books, because they will grow your overall ability more. But yeah, I would say if you can get into them and you're naturally interested in the visual novels that are available to play, then yeah, I would say they're a really great resource. And I just should also mention that I've also played, I've played Fate Stay Night, I've played Steins Gate, I've played Subarashiki Hibi. I can't get into them. It's not that I just didn't try the right one. I find them all boring. I find the characters way too out there and not realistic enough for me to get into. So it's not a problem that I haven't tried it enough. I've spent probably hundreds of hours trying to play these games. But if you like them, then go for it. I think they have the potential to be a good resource to learn from. So Indy H asks, "Hi Matt. Like many people, I've had a lot more free time at home recently due to COVID-19. I thought this would at least be an opportunity to increase my immersion, but what I've found over the past few weeks is that I consistently max out at around 3 to 4 hours of active immersion a day, regardless of how much free time I have. On top of the active, I get another 2 to 3 hours of passive immersion. Before this, I easily managed 3 hours regularly, so I thought I would have increased my immersion by a lot more. I wondered if you'd have any advice or insights as to why this is. I've recently tried time boxing throughout the day, 20 minutes reading, 20 minutes watching/card minding, 20 minutes YouTube, and that seems to help a bit, but only to an extent. I don't end up watching English media, rather just potter around the internet, finding things to do around the house, etc. Maybe this is just my natural limit for consuming media comfortably, but I thought I'd get your opinion on it. I'd also be really interested to hear about other people's schedules who are in the same situation of self-isolating. Thanks, and hope everyone stays safe and sensible during all of this." Yeah, so first I would say don't beat yourself up, because, if you find that you max out after 3 to 4 hours, then, first of all, that just accept that that's the reality. It's not your fault. It's not necessarily something you have direct control over. So it is what it is to a certain extent. And so it's more a matter of, how can we work with this? So first of all, I think it's totally normal that if you're used to spending 3 hours a day actively immersing, and then suddenly you have boatloads of free time, that you can't just instantly start immersing 10 hours a day, right? That some people might be able to do that, but it makes sense that a lot of people just aren't going to be able to do that, because you can't go to 0 to 100 that quickly, right? Active immersion does, depending on the type of person that you are, use up a lot of energy and take a certain amount of discipline to really engage with. And so I could see that you kind of just run your battery out after 3 hours, and then it's really hard to get yourself to do more because you just don't want to do it anymore. So totally understandable. Don't blame yourself for it. But one thing I would say is that try to gradually grow your time. If you max out at 3 to 4 hours, try to see if you can get 5 hours one day, or maybe even 4.5 hours, and just make that your goal. So instead of saying, okay, I have 10 hours a day, so I should be doing 10 hours of immersion, yet I'm falling short by only doing 4, instead just be like, okay, so my current baseline is 3 to 4. Let me see if I can push that a little bit and get 4.5. Because that would be the next step, right? Wherever you are, you want to ask yourself, what's the next step to push my cutting edge forward? And that would probably be 4.5. So see if you can do that. And if you do that, then feel really satisfied that you just pushed your limit and made progress in terms of how much you're able to immerse. So that's the framework that I would adopt. And then getting more concrete, I would say try to do more different types of immersion. Maybe start reading more series at once, watching more series at once. If you're normally the type of person who just watches one series to completion before moving on to a next series, try to start having 3 different series going on at once. Because sometimes you just get bored of watching a single series. I know for me, sometimes I get really into a Netflix show, but no matter how into it I am, sometimes after a couple episodes, I'm just burnt out on it, right? I want to think about something else. I want to do something else. So sometimes if you have 3 different series, maybe that all come from different genres or are in different styles. one live action romance drama and one like science fiction anime and stuff like that, then you have just more options to choose from, and you can say, okay, I'm not in the mood for that one show, but I am kind of in this mood for this other show. And so by spreading out more like this, then it's more probably just going to be easier to spend more time total in Japanese. And so that's one thing I would say. And then, yeah, time boxing, I think, is really useful. I would say, it sounds like you said you got at least a little bit of success with that. So I'd say try to keep going with that. Try to take longer breaks in addition to shorter breaks. So maybe after 3 to 4 hours, you feel pretty burnt out. Try taking like a 2-hour break where you don't do any Japanese. And then after that, see if you can do like 20 minutes more or like 30 minutes more. So maybe try to not adopt the mindset of like, okay, I'm done for the day, so I'm not even going to try. And instead think like, okay, I'm done for right now, but who knows how I'll feel in 2 hours. And then in 2 hours, say like, maybe I could do 20 minutes more, or maybe even just 15 minutes more. Try to not have a minimum where it's like, well, if I can't immerse for at least this much more, then it's not even worth starting. Because that mindset a lot can be really inhibiting and stop you from getting in as much immersion as you could. So I would say try to kind of finesse the situation with these types of strategies. Keep playing with it. View it as a game. How much immersion can I get myself to do? Try different stuff. And at the end of the day, don't beat yourself up. I can tell that you are trying your best from the way that you worded your question, right? So whatever you're able to do, that is your best. Don't feel bad about it not being more than you think that you should be able to, because the reality is the reality. But I think that you'll be able to keep making incremental progress over time if you keep making an effort to improve the situation, like it sounds like you have been. So Gnismit asks, what is your view on IQ and language acquisition? Is there a correlation? How different would be experience for not very intelligent person compared to relatively smart person? Maybe 90 through 140 IQ. So I don't know for sure. There's nothing definitive I can say on this topic. And I'm also just very wary to talk about it because there's a lot of debate about, is IQ even a thing? Is it even a valid measure of actual intelligence? Is it actually important for your success as a human being and all these things? There's people on both sides. I don't really have a dog in that fight. I definitely believe there is something like IQ, which you could say like different people have different amounts of intelligence. And I think this is kind of separate from knowledge or wisdom. Sometimes I'm talking to someone and I can just sense that they're extremely intelligent, maybe more intelligent than I am. And they can pick up entirely new concepts extremely quickly. They're, as they would say in Japanese, the circuits in their brain move very quickly. And on the other hand, there's sometimes there's certain people who I talk to and they just feel a little bit slow. And I can just see that explaining a certain concept to them will take a lot of time. They might not be able to really grasp it. And again, I can intuit that this is separate from specific knowledge, specific experience, and stuff like that. So I don't know if this type of like intelligence, which I intuitively sense in different people who I talk to, is IQ. Maybe it's not. Maybe IQ is a separate thing than what I'm sensing. But I definitely sense that intelligence is a thing. And not to like discriminate, not that if you have less intelligence, then you deserve to be less happy or deserve to be treated less. I don't think anything like that is true, but I also think it's just not realistic to pretend that it's not a thing, because I think we all know it's a thing. We know that some people are smarter than other people, and that's just a reality of life. It might be unfortunate, but it's just a reality of life. And so I don't think it's productive to pretend that this reality doesn't exist, when I think anyone who's not really delusional can see that this is true to some extent. And I doubt that you can really make yourself more intelligent on a fundamental level. Like maybe to a certain extent, I'm sure that if you improve your diet and you exercise more and you start reading really high quality books more, to a certain extent, you will become a much smarter person. But I think there's a limit. Like if someone is born and they're just on the kind of low end of the intelligence spectrum, no matter what they do, they're never going to be able to fully catch up to someone on the higher end of the spectrum when it comes to intelligence. Now, they might still be able to be successful and still be able to provide a lot of value to society and other people. But in terms of just this raw intelligence that I'm talking about, I think It's largely something that is set in stone, either when you're born or after you live out your childhood. I think a lot of very early experiences you have could play a role on this, because I've heard that getting stimulated in certain ways as a small child can largely affect the way that your brain ends up developing later on when you grow up. But I don't know too much about it. But anyway, how does this affect language acquisition? Well, I think that's a really tricky thing, because first of all, everyone seems to successfully acquire their native language regardless of how intelligent they are. Now, a lot of people actually don't realize that this is true because they have a kind of what I would consider to be a misguided view of what it means to be fully native level or fluent in a target language, right? So, for example, there's certain people who grow up in an area of the United States, let's say, that has a certain speaking style. So let's say like Brooklyn. So my grandma actually grew up in Brooklyn, and she speaks English with a Brooklyn accent. And so the way that she speaks English in terms of pronunciation, vocabulary, and grammar, even the grammar is actually different, is significantly different than the way that I speak English. And throughout my grandma's life, she was basically told that the way that she speaks English is improper because it's differs. It's not the same as the type of English that you hear on like news broadcasts and things like that. And so she's actually internalized this idea that she can't speak English properly because she speaks a dialect that differs from what's kind of generally considered to be the standard dialect of English within the United States. But the thing is, she speaks her dialect perfectly, right? She speaks her Brooklyn dialect with the exact same grammar and the exact same pronunciation and vocabulary usage as all the other people who speak Brooklyn English. And so it's not that she failed to acquire proper English, it's that she perfectly acquired a different dialect of English. And so a lot of times this gets confused. And so when it comes to the British English, it's very easy to see that this is the case. But in other times it's harder to see that this is the case. Like, for example, things when it comes to grammar, like saying Lucas, like me and Lucas went to the store instead of Lucas and I went to the store. This is, I mean, if you want to call it a mistake, this is a mistake that I made for a long time until someone started to correct me and say, hey, don't say that, it's wrong. And I started to consciously change the way that I say it. But the thing is, I still hear a lot of people around me say, me and Lucas went to the store. So for all I know, I could have actually acquired me and Lucas, that grammar pattern, from other people in my environment. So people in my environment spoke English a certain way, and I fully acquired English in the way that it was spoken around me, yet the way that it was spoken around me differs from some official standard or that is, conceived by certain other people in society or whatever. And so it's not that I failed to acquire proper English, it's that I successfully acquired English, but the version that I acquired has what would be considered errors in it by when looked at through the view of the general consensus of what proper speaking is. So there's this phenomenon of when you go to school and you get educated, you learn these like objective standards of what proper usage is. And through that, you change the way that you speak. And it gets to this point where you might be speaking significantly differently than the way that you did before you had any formal training in the English language. But really, it's not that you failed to acquire proper speaking the first time. It's that you perfectly acquired the dialect that people spoke around you, and then later you found out that actually that dialect itself is not considered to be the most prestigious way to speak, so then you actively change it. But the thing is, if you take this view of people are perfectly acquiring the language that is spoken in their direct environment, it seems that even people with really low intelligence pretty much perfectly acquire their native language. Now, they might not be the most articulate. They might stutter a lot and say a lot and kind of not have the most elegant sentence structure when they speak. And I definitely see some correlation between just how well you can form sentences and intelligence. Not a direct, one-to-one correlation, but there definitely seems to be this pattern where people who are generally pretty intelligent are better at formulating sentences and expressing themselves when compared to people who are less intelligent, although a lot of other factors are at play as well, such as just how much practice you've had speaking and things like that. But definitely noticed that. So there is, to a certain degree, we could say some sort of correlation between how well people can use their native language and intelligence. I noticed some pattern, but on a fundamental level, when it comes to just like pronunciation, like even people who are very unintelligent still speak their native language with perfect vowels, perfect consonants, perfect connected speech, like perfect sound changes in the way that they slur their speech and things like that. For the most part, they don't make any grammar mistakes if you take the perspective of they're speaking like people in their immediate environment, and they very rarely use words wrong or things like that. Sometimes it happens, but I don't really think this is a reflection of intelligence. I think it's more of a reflection of they just haven't read a lot, so maybe they misinterpreted a word. Like for me, for the longest time, I thought that the phrase all intents and purposes was all intensive purposes. But that's because the way that people say it in real life just sounds like that, right? Like people say, yeah, for all intensive purposes, and it really sounds like that. So the fact that I misacquired that phrase isn't a reflection of my intelligence. It's just a reflection of me not having read enough English, because when you read English, you see it in print and you see that it's actually intents and purposes. So it has to do more with my background of how much time I spent reading, not how intelligent I am. So there's some stuff like that where maybe people who are less intelligent tend to read less, and so then they have more errors in their system like that. But again, I don't really think that's a direct product of a lack of intelligence. So I'm all over the place because there's so many different... I'm trying to make a nuanced point, but my thoughts aren't that organized. So I feel like I'm all over the place. I don't know if anyone will even be able to fully follow what I'm trying to say. But anyway, I guess to summarize what I've said so far. So yeah, intelligence is a thing. And on a base level, it seems like even people who are rather unintelligent can, on a technical sense, fully acquire their native language. But of course, when it comes to certain ways of using their native language, they seem to be less effective than more intelligent people. But again, that could partly be due to reading, because I think that the more you read, the better you get at using your native language. And there definitely seems to be a correlation where people who are more intelligent are naturally more interested in reading because they're naturally more fascinated by ideas. Whereas unintelligent people, maybe as a general trend, aren't as naturally interested in that. Of course, there are exceptions and stuff like that. But overall, yeah, that's what I would say for native speakers. So then it comes to second language acquisition. Now, I have definitely personally noticed a trend where people who I would consider to be generally more intelligent seem to generally be more successful at language acquisition than people who generally seem to be less intelligent. Now, I definitely have seen people who are not the brightest and, not the sharpest tool in the shed learn a foreign language, even like an English speaker who's not that bright. I've seen English speakers not that bright learn languages like Japanese to the point where they're completely fluent and they can read no problem and they can use the language no problem. But overall, their accuracy in terms of how many grammar mistakes they make, how accurately they use words and how often they misuse words, and how much they're able to get their pronunciation close to native speakers, does tend to seem to be less than that of someone who's more intelligent. And I think this makes sense just because a lot of language acquisition is pattern recognition, right? You have to be noticing patterns in how native speakers do things so that you can emulate things as well. And a lot of times it comes down to making very fine distinctions between meanings and usages and things like that. And so maybe someone who's less intelligent, has less pattern recognition ability, will be more likely to overgeneralize the meaning of a certain word, right? So maybe there's a word that it means one thing and there's a different word that means something slightly different, and they kind of confuse the two meanings or something like that. But of course, it also depends on how much have they studied, how many hours have they immersed. So definitely, if you have the most intelligent person in the world who's immersed for 1,000 hours, and then you have a pretty dumb person who's immersed for like 10,000 hours, the dumb person is going to be way better than the really smart guy. So even though I think intelligence is playing a role, the total amount of hours you spend immersing is going to trump all other factors. But if you had a really smart guy who's immersed for 1,000 hours and a really dumb guy who's immersed for 1,000 hours, probably the guy who is really smart is going to be at a higher level at that point. And I think it's just because second language acquisition is different than first language acquisition in that you tend to rely on your general cognitive software a little bit more than in first language acquisition. First language acquisition, I think it's really close to like 99% just a unconscious process where the language acquisition center in your brain is doing all the work, and cognitively not that much is happening, like consciously in your prefrontal lobe or whatever. I mean, I don't really know how the brain works, so maybe the natural like Stephen Krashen style unconscious language acquisition does use your prefrontal lobe. I don't know. But anyway, I think that when you're a child, it's really all that natural Krashen style unconscious process, whereas as an adult, it's more of a combined effort between the unconscious language learning hardware and software and your conscious cognitive thinking about the language and noticing patterns using general cognition and things like that. And so because of this, I think that the smarter you are, the more patterns you recognize, the more quickly that you recognize patterns. And so there will be quicker progress overall, and the final result will probably be better. But like I said, I still think that even extremely unintelligent people, it feels really controversial just to say that, but come on, let's be real, guys. We know that there are some people who are really dumb in this world. That's the reality. I still think that even those people, if they apply the method properly, then they're still going to get fluent and they're still going to get good results. And the real issue that I see is that people who are not that bright have a really hard time understanding the method and understanding how the techniques work, why the techniques work. And so a lot of times they're not able to apply the method properly. And that is where the real issues come up, is that they can't really understand how to study efficiently. And because of that, they don't study efficiently, and then they don't get their results. So I think when it comes to second language acquisition, a lot of it, not all of it, because I definitely think the pattern recognition thing is that, but I think the bigger issue is, can you understand how to apply the method? Can you follow the instructions properly? Because, I mean, I hate to say this, but just to be transparent, like, I do consultations with people, right? Where people will pay me $60 to do a video call for them, with a video call with them for an hour. And I try to do my best to help them get on track with their language learning. And there's some people I've talked to who just are very slow. And I've talked to them multiple times. And every time I talk to them, they seem to have not grasped anything I told them the previous time. Like, they just completely misinterpret it in really wild ways. And it's like playing a game of telephone. Like, you know, that game with telephone where you have 10 people in a line, the first person tells something to the second person, and the second person repeats that thing to the third person, and so on. By the time you get to the line, the end of the line, the message has become completely distorted. It's like that, except it's just the moment I tell him, it's already been completely distorted. And a lot of times I feel like, wow, it's very unlikely that this person is going to be able to succeed with language learning because they're not even able to grasp the instructions. And of course, this is a tiny minority of people. You know, if we assume intelligence is a bell curve, these are people on the far end of the bell curve. So most people are not like that. Most people watching this is not like that. I would imagine that because I talk about very high level, abstract language learning concepts, people who are naturally attracted to my content are probably above average in intelligence, although it's kind of really arrogant to say. But I would wager that. And so if you're watching this video, chances are this is not an issue that you're going to personally have. But that has been my personal observation, that people who are more challenged intellectually, the real problem is that they can't apply the method. And so to them, having some kind of tutor that would not teach them the content of the language, but would just constantly keep them on track and make sure they're doing the right thing would be really valuable, because otherwise they're probably just not going to be able to like stay on track and things like that. But I think even if you're really dumb, if you really follow the method and apply the method correctly, you still will get fluent. And I don't even think that your progress will be that much slower than someone who's hyper intelligent. It will probably be a little bit slower, and the final result will probably be worse, but you'll still be totally fluent and functional. And I don't think it will really cause that many issues. So that's my view. Hopefully I didn't trigger anyone. I'm just trying to be real here, but that is my current view on intelligence. So Eduardo Lavacue probably not pronouncing that correctly, asks, I've heard you mention somewhere that for your 10 sentences a day, even if you gathered more than 10 sentences a day, you distill it to the most valuable sentences and only make those into cards. Then on the next day, you'd gather a new 10 valuable sentences and so on. At what point do you recommend dropping this approach and just adding every new word you hear? That isn't too rare. Or what's your latest recommended approach to picking which words to make cards for? I assume this will change for different stages. So yeah, my approach for the bulk of my language learning experience for making cards was whenever I was immersing and I came across a word that I didn't know, I would take that entire sentence and I'd add it to a text file. And then at the end of the day, or whenever I was going to make cards for that day, I'd choose 10 sentences off of this text file and make 10 cards. So what I actually did was a little bit different than what you said. And I don't know if this is a problem with you misinterpreting what I said in the past, or it could be that I just simplified the reality in order to answer a question more quickly. But what I actually did was, so like I just said, I would have this text file with all the sentences that I came across, which appeared to be one target or I+1. And at any given point in time, there was over 100 sentences on this list. So I would just choose 10 sentences off this list. I basically just choose the ones that appealed to me the most and looked the most interesting, and I just naturally felt that I wanted to learn. So I might be choosing sentences that I learned yesterday. I might be choosing a sentence that I learned a month ago. I would not limit it to the words that I found that specific day. It was just, I had a list of a bunch of new words that I wanted to learn because these are new words that came up in my immersion. And so that meant that I wanted to know them because I want to know whatever comes up in my immersion. And I would just choose them off the list. And a lot of times, the bulk of them would consist of sentences that I found either that day or the previous day, just because a lot of times the sentences that I found a month ago, the reason why they've been on the list for a whole month is because they don't look that exciting, or they look like really hard, or for whatever reason, they didn't look that juicy, so I left them there. So if a sentence has been on my list for more than a couple days, that probably means it's not that juicy looking. And so naturally, most of the cards that I make are going to consist of sentences that I found in the past couple days, because those are the newest, freshest, exciting ones. But not necessarily the case, right? Sometimes all the sentences I found that day would look really hard, or just not really work out that well. Like I'd look them up and still just not understand them, or I'd look it up and they'd look way too rare. And so I would just end up only making cards for sentences that I found like last week or something like that. And so I basically recommend doing this. I never recommend just starting to make a card for every single word you come across, because I don't think you ever want to be making more than a set number of cards each day. So for me, it was 10 cards a day because that's what I was able to be really consistent with for years at a time. And consistency is the true key to long-term success. But maybe some people can consistently do 15 a day. Maybe some people can consistently do 20 a day. But however many you can do consistently a day, I think you should stick to that. And you don't want to just randomly do 50 cards one day because you happen to pick up a new book with tons of words from a new domain that you've never seen before. And now you have to make 50 cards because you happen to come across 50 words, right? I don't think that's a good strategy at all. And I also don't think that if you happen to only come across 5 words in one day because you were just happened to be reading an easy book that day, that you reduce the amount of new words that you learn, even though you still have this backlog of tons of new words that you still have come across but haven't learned yet. So ultimately, I think that the number of new words that you learn each day should not be directly dependent upon how many new words you have found that day or the previous day. I think that these should be basically two independent things. So just constantly be collecting sentences and then be making the same number of cards each day from your list of sentences that you've gathered up until the present moment. And how should you choose which sentences to make cards for on your list of words? Well, I think it's pretty good to just choose the ones that look the most interesting, the most juicy. That always worked well for me. But of course, it's probably also a good idea to take into account frequency to a certain degree, because learning a word that is so uncommon that you're probably never going to see it again isn't a good use of your time. So probably some combination of frequency and how interesting it looks to you personally and how much you just naturally want to learn it. But I wouldn't really worry about when you found the word. If you found the word a month ago, but it still looks juicy and it still looks valuable, then just learn it, right? If you found the word yesterday, but it's super uncommon, then don't learn it. I wouldn't be that caught up on when you actually found the sentences, if that makes sense. So hopefully that answers your question. So Anit, Piertush, I don't know how to pronounce that, asks, you mentioned in your 3-hour video that you could feel yourself getting better every day. Even on days where I do 4+ hours of immersion, I do not get this feeling. Is this normal? Did you always get this feeling? So yeah, there was a very long stretch in my initial experience learning Japanese where I think I could confidently say, yeah, I felt that I was improving every day. So let me explain what this actually meant. So every day, or most days, I would hear some word in my immersion that I had never picked out before, right? So maybe I'm watching anime with no subtitles and I would hear some word that maybe I knew because I made a card for it in some point in the past, but I never actually picked it out all on my own just through listening and understood it before. Now, it wasn't necessarily that I learned that word for the first time that day or the day before. I might have learned that word months ago, but it just so happened that I was never able to pick it out of my immersion until that day. And so every single day there would be usually multiple things where it was like, oh, I just heard that word and I've never actually picked that word out all on my own up until now. It was just like a first time experience. And also I would notice that once I would pick something up for the first time, hopefully that noise of someone mowing their lawn or something isn't too loud. Once I picked it up for the first time, then I would start picking it up pretty often. So I'd be able to tell like, oh, cool, this is the third time this day that I've picked up this thing and things like that. So I would just notice that the frequency at which I was understanding certain words and certain structures was just constantly increasing. It was really easy to notice because maybe like 3 times in one day, I understand a given word that I know that last week I had never understood in my immersion before. So I definitely had the sense that I was improving every day because I was understanding new things all the time, or the frequency at which I was understanding certain things was obviously going up at a very noticeable rate. And there was also the aspect of I could go back and watch an anime that I watched last month, and I would noticeably understand more of it. Like maybe the last time I watched it, I was understanding 30%. Now I understand 40%. And I can just notice whole sentences that were like, oh, I just understood that. Definitely didn't understand that last month when I watched this and stuff like that. So I would pretty regularly go back and watch content that I liked that I'd already seen before. Whenever I would do this, I would notice that I understand more of it than I did last time. So yeah, I was definitely noticing that I was getting better all the time. Now, going a little bit into how, at what stages throughout my journey that I was experiencing this. So at the very, very beginning, you are so bad at the language and you know so little that even though you are improving in terms of your perception and in terms of your ability to hear the phonemes and parse word boundaries and so on, the progress is probably so slow that it's hard to really perceive. So at the very beginning, maybe for like the first 6 months, it's more difficult to notice your progress. But after that point, you start to kind of pick up, things start to snowball, and it does start to get to the point where you're learning words every day, and then you're starting to hear those words in your immersion in the coming weeks and months, and you're experiencing this phenomenon that I just explained. Then you come out on the other end and you get to the point where you're so good at the language, you're like high, intermediate, low, advanced, that you've already made all the gains that are easy to make, and you're starting to experience diminishing returns. So once you reach this point, it starts to feel like you're progressing slower. Now, in reality, you're progressing faster than ever because the better you get at a language, the easier it is to learn more. But the thing is, all of the content that you're learning, all the new words and structures and the gains in your listening ability, they don't make as big of a difference because the difference between 90% and 91% feels less significant than the difference between 30 and 31%. That's just how it works. And so you're learning new things at the same rate, but they don't seem to benefit you in the same way as they did before because you start off learning the really common, frequently used words, and then every time you learn a frequently used word, your comprehension jumps up a significant amount. And then you learn all the common words. Now you're just learning the uncommon words, and each uncommon word you learn doesn't add that much to the total of your comprehension and stuff like that. So basically, you start off feeling like you're not making progress. Then you start to feel like you're making more and more progress. And eventually you peak at this point where you feel like you're moving super quickly. And then it starts to go back down and you start to get to the point where you can't really feel your progress anymore. And for me, it feels like my progress at this point is super slow. But I know that over time, my perception of Japanese is improving because I can listen to old recordings of myself speaking Japanese and I can notice more stuff that sounds off than I used to be able to. And there's certain things that I can understand more easily now. But overall, my progress still feels super slow. A lot of that's because I don't immerse that much. And at the point that I'm at now, I'd have to immerse a lot and practice speaking a lot to get better. So that's a lot of it. But basically, that's how it works. So I don't know where you are in the process. If you're still within the first 6 months I was talking about, it is normal, I would say, to not really feel your progress. If you're already approaching fluency and it feels like your progress is slower, that's also normal. But if you are in between those two places and you're immersing 4 hours a day, then you should be able to feel your progress pretty rapidly. So if you're immersing 4 hours a day and you are not experiencing any of the stuff that I'm talking about, then you probably do want to reevaluate what you're doing because it sounds like something could be not really working properly. But I would imagine that maybe you just weren't looking for progress in the right types of ways, and that if you are looking for your progress in the way that I'm explaining, right? Like, are you understanding words naturally that a couple weeks ago you wouldn't be able to understand? Probably the answer is going to be yes. And so a lot of times it's just, are you paying attention to your own progress in the right ways? So let's keep going. So Billy asks, "Hey Matt, I've been reading nonfiction novels, mostly about business, self-help, psychology, and find those to be easier than things like YouTube comments, Yahoo Chiebukuro, which are written by everyday people. I think it may be due to the fact that novels are written very clearly and logically, whereas the writing of your average person may not be. Wanted to hear your thoughts on this paradox." So yeah, I wouldn't really call it a paradox because it's not very hard to explain. I would say that, yeah, probably your prediction or your kind of speculation is probably accurate, where novels are written in a very systematic, formulaic way. The points that they're making are laid out in clear-cut, systematic arguments, whereas writing online can be very disorganized. It can be all over the place. It can leave out a lot of information and require you to infer a lot, and also it can just contain a lot of slang and things like that. Like, just one example, right, is that when you're reading a book, they're never going to leave out particles. Whereas when you're reading YouTube comments and Chiebukuro, they're going to leave out particles all the time. And so it's harder to understand speech without the particles because you have to infer what the particle would have been and what role that word is playing within the greater sentence. And so it totally makes sense that if you don't have a lot of practice reading really casual online written language, then you're not going to be very good at it. Now, overall, I would say that the range of vocabulary used and the types of grammar structure used in actual books is more difficult than what's used in everyday language. But to a certain extent, what you're used to trumps inherent difficulty. So a lot of people would say that, for example, like maybe watching the news is pretty difficult, whereas watching slice of life anime is pretty easy. But if all you did was immerse with the news from day one, and you never watched any slice of life anime, you would probably reach a point where you can understand the news easily, but you still couldn't understand slice of life anime because the words and the types of structures and the inflection patterns that come up in slice of life anime never come up in the news. So you wouldn't have any exposure to them, and so you wouldn't be able to read them. So in a certain way, there is such a thing as inherent difficulty, but I would say that familiarity trumps that. And so it sounds like what's happening in your case is that overall, books are harder to understand than YouTube comments, but you have spent a lot of time reading books, not a lot of time reading YouTube comments, so you're better at reading books than YouTube comments. If you spent a little bit of time reading YouTube comments and reading Chiebukuro, you would very quickly figure out how the slang works, how the dropping particles works, and it would be very easy for you to learn to apply the ability that you gain through reading books to understanding comments as well. So Mr. Paul Person asks, do you have any suggestions for someone looking to get into translation? What ability level with the language should I get before I start practicing translating? So let's assume that you're translating from your target language into your native language. So in this situation, output ability is completely irrelevant, right? All you need to do is be able to accurately understand your target language and have a good grasp of how to write in your native language. So I would say you probably want to reach a point where you're extremely comfortable and proficient in understanding your target language before you start translating. Because if you don't really understand at a very high, precise level how your target language works, then you're going to be a awful translator, right? If you can't tell the exact nuance of what certain words mean and the exact difference between two different ways of saying something, then you're not going to be able to translate that nuanced difference into your native language. So it's very crucial, I would say, that you have a very high, precise level of comprehension. But if you do have that, well, then you're good to go. That's all you need. You don't need to be able to speak or anything, assuming that you don't want to be an interpreter. And what I would wager happens to a lot of translators is that let's say they go to college and they get a degree in a certain foreign language. Like, let's say you go to college, you get a Japanese degree. Well, most people who go to college to get a Japanese degree, by the time they graduate, they're not very good at Japanese because the total amount of hours they've spent actually exposing themselves to Japanese is relatively small compared to someone who has been learning through immersion, right? So they're not very good at understanding the language. They're not going to be able to actually read a book without a dictionary. They're going to have to use a dictionary to look up tons of words every page and still be very blurry about a lot of what's going on in the book. And so they don't have a very precise ability to understand the target language. So when they translate, they're going to make a lot of mistakes. They're going to mistranslate a lot of things. They're going to do weird things with tone and things like that. And they're basically going to have to probably just kind of fudge and bullshit a lot of what's going on. Now, the problem with translation is that if you have person A who wants to translate their book into Japanese, then the problem is they don't know Japanese most of the time. That's why they have to pay someone to translate it. And the type of person who buys a translation of a book, like let's say the type of person who buys a Japanese translation of a book, generally they're buying the Japanese translation of the book because they don't speak the original language. In this case, let's just say English, right? So you have American person A who wants to translate their book into Japanese, and then Japanese person B who doesn't know English, so they buy the Japanese translation. So because these two people cannot communicate with each other, there's no way for them to become aware of any mistranslations or inaccuracies within the translation. So basically, the middleman, person C, who just graduated with a Japanese degree, he could basically bullshit a lot of the translation. Like, he could just make up any portions of the translation that they didn't fully understand, and no one would realize it because the American person A doesn't understand Japanese, so he can't check the quality of the translation, and Japanese person B doesn't know English, so he can't check whether the translation matches the original or not. So I think what happens is that a lot of translators who are new to the field do a lot of bullshit, and they get away with it because no one can notice. No one has the ability to notice. And over time, through actually engaging in translation over the course of years, they eventually get in enough immersion that they actually end up getting good at the language. And then in the long term, they actually become a competent translator. In some cases, I'm sure there's other cases where people just, their whole career, they're like a professional translator for 20 years and they're still just doing shit translations. Pretty sure that happens quite often because I come across a lot of just awful translations in my day-to-day life, reading things that have been translated from Japanese into English and from English into Japanese. So I know a lot of bullshit translation goes on. But I would say that for a lot of the people who actually end up being good translators, they get good at translating and they get good at understanding their target language on the job. Because, they graduate from school and they need to get a job so they can pay their bills, right? So they just start doing the work even though they're not really qualified yet. But then after spending thousands of hours translating, they eventually get enough immersion under their belt where they get good. So I would say that this is the common pattern for most people. And it's sad because it means that a lot of really awful translations are getting created and floating around in the world, which is probably causing a lot of misunderstandings and damage and things like that. But this is probably the reality because most people, they don't know how to get good at a language on their own, right? They don't have access to like things like MIA or AJAT or immersion learning and things like that. So definitely this is a pattern that exists. And this is probably like the answer to the question of if no one understands efficient language acquisition, then how do translators come into existence? I think it's kind of like this. But if you wanted to be a good translator, then I would say don't start translating until you have a very high level of understanding of the language. Otherwise, you're doomed to just create really bad translations. And there's really no point like trying to practice translating something into English if you don't even have a good ability to understand the original, right? The real art of translation is being able to perfectly understand the original and find the best possible way to express that in English. That keeps as much of the original meaning and nuance as possible without sounding awkward or weird and fitting all the other requirements that generally come along with having to translate a fixed piece of media or something like that. And so translation is definitely a skill that exists separately from just language ability. So you can be amazing at English, amazing at Japanese, doesn't mean you're a good translator, because the act of going from one language into another is a separate skill you have to train. But having a very high level of understanding in your target language is a prerequisite before you can even begin to train the skill of going from one language into another. At least that's my view. I don't actually translate. I don't have that much experience with translation, so you got to take all of that with a grain of salt. So Tombo12 asks, spoke with a linguist recently who spoke highly of immersion, but still insisted on the importance of output. A main reason being, when you output incorrectly and get corrected, it's an impactful event and creates strong mental connections. The detriments of output have been discussed at length, so my question is, in addition to the many aha moments that occur naturally via immersion, is there any viable way to increase these said impactful moments that is compatible with MIA? So yeah, this is a really common argument that you'll hear, that immersion or that outputting is the best way to learn, because when you get something wrong, that is a kind of shameful and embarrassing moment, which therefore creates a very strong memory because it has a very big emotional charge. And we all know that. Well, actually, I don't know if we all know that, but memories are very linked with emotions. And so if any memory that is encoded at a period of time when you're experiencing a very strong emotion will be encoded very strongly and it'll be easy to remember. So that's basically what they're saying. But two things is that like for me, I spent a long time only getting input in Japanese while doing very little output, right? And when I started to output, I still made mistakes, but compared to a more traditional style learner who's kind of outputting from the beginning and not getting nearly as much input as I was, the amount of mistakes that I made were extremely few. Like Japanese people would compliment me saying like, whoa, you get all the particles right. How do you do that? Every other learner I've talked to like always messes up the particles. And so if you're just looking at the facts, right? I never had to go through experiences of making mistakes with the particles and then getting corrected in order to reach the point where I could use particles correctly, right? I just skipped that whole step of making mistakes and getting embarrassed and whatever. And just through input, I was able to use particles correctly. Whereas there's other people who maybe they tried that approach of speaking, using the particle wrong, getting corrected, feeling embarrassed, and they made the strong memory. But ultimately, does that strong memory really help them use particles correctly? Because in order to use particles correctly, you have to understand how particles work on an intuitive level. They have to be part of your unconscious model of the language. And having this one conscious event of you having used a particle wrong, I mean, yeah, you're going to remember that one event very strongly, and maybe when you're speaking, that memory will pop up. But ultimately, it's not a replacement for the intuitive, systematic understanding of how particles are used within the Japanese language. And if you don't have that systematic intuition, then you're not going to be able to speak with correct particles. So this whole idea that basically being able to input at a very high level in the language is the result of like a bunch of just individual chunks of knowledge or chunks of like little units of memory, it just doesn't really play out in reality, right? And in fact, I could even see getting corrected when you make a mistake having negative effects on your output. Because let's just take the pitch accent example, right? Let's say that, okay, well, first I gotta just explain this. So if you are studying Japanese, you probably know the word ima, which means now. And the pitch accent is a tamadaka. It's ima. But when you say imamade, which means until now, it's ima, the word now, and then the particle that means until. So imamade, until now, that as a set phrase has a different pitch accent pattern where the ima part is pronounced heiban, and then it drops after the ma. So it's imamade. It's not imamade. So the pitch accent changes when you add the made, the pitch accent of the now, the ima part. So I could see that someone says like ima, like ima gakko ni ikimasu, and then they get corrected. They say, oh no, it's not ima, it's ima. So then the person is very embarrassed. They make this very strong memory of, okay, ima, it's pronounced as a tamadaka. It's pronounced ima. And then they start going imamade, and instead of imamade, because they just have this really strong, like, conscious memory of the word now is pronounced a certain way. Whereas if you would have just gotten a lot of immersion and would have just kind of absorbed the pitch accent naturally, which I do think generally requires paying some attention to pitch in general, but if you would have cultivated an intuition for the fact that ima is one way and imamade is another way, then you would have probably just gotten it right the first time, and it wouldn't have been a problem. And it applies to all aspects of language, right? Like a lot of times a word can be used multiple ways, and maybe you used it wrong in a certain way and you get corrected, and now basically you're like extra self-conscious about the way that you used this word because you used it wrong once, and now whenever you use the word, you're like extra thinking about it and trying to like consciously make sure that you're using it in the right way and all this stuff, and you're just crowding your mind with all this conscious thinking about using the language that's going to get in the way from you just using it naturally and intuitively, like the way we use our native language. So really, if you want to be able to speak well or output well, you need to have an intuitive understanding and be able to feel what feels right. And that only comes from getting lots of input and letting your unconscious mind build the model of how it works. It doesn't come from just having these isolated events of memory where you just got embarrassed because you got something wrong. And let's see, there's one more other thing that I wanted to say. Look, basically, of course, output is still important if you want to get good at speaking. And I still feel like I need to do more output in Japanese to get my output to a higher level, because I have the potential. I have done enough input, but I still just have to build the muscle memory pathways in my brain of expressing certain ideas, using certain words and things like that. But the thing is, I already can tell when I make a mistake and when I'm getting it, when I'm saying something correctly. I still make a lot of mistakes, and that's where the practice comes in. But the thing is, I don't need to get corrected because I already have the intuition. So output is still extremely important for getting good at speaking, but it only is really useful once you have enough intuition where you can correct yourself on certain things. Now, of course, there are still holes in my intuition, and sometimes Japanese people will correct me. And I have had the experience of getting corrected in a certain way. Actually, I remember there's this girl, and her name was Sakura. And when you have the name Sakura as a name, it's a tamadaka, the pitch accent pattern. But when you're talking about Sakura as in the flower of cherry blossom, it's Heiban. And once she told me, she was like, sometimes you pronounce my name like correctly, and sometimes you pronounce it as if you were saying like the flower. And then when she told me that, for the next while, like every time I was about to say your name, I would remember like, oh, make sure you say it a tamadaka. And then I think I got a lot better at it. So there's definitely some room for that. But the thing is, it only works when you're already like 99% there. Because thinking about language and stuff, like I said, it uses up a lot of your brain's RAM. And you only have a little bit of RAM memory like left over or to like available at any given point in time to be consciously monitoring how you're speaking the language. So you have to be at the point where you can already speak decently without using any conscious thinking, in order to be able to use the little bit of conscious thinking RAM that you have left over to make little tiny changes on the surface, right? So if you haven't already gotten a ton of input and have integrated that input and gotten to the point where you can speak naturally using your intuition, then the whole process of consciously getting corrected, it's not going to go well. You're not going to be able to actually like integrate the corrections and things like that. So overall, that's what I have to say on this, how I think it's, of course, on a certain level, getting corrected and making strong memories based off of getting feedback from native speakers has a role, but it's not the type of role that they're suggesting, where they're saying like, oh, you need to output from the beginning because it's going to like accelerate the total process of you acquiring the language. That I think is definitely not true. But I'm not even really sure that was your actual question. It sounds like your actual questions were just, is there any way to increase impactful moments? I mean, if you're immersing with content that you like, and that is really meaningful to you, then you'll have lots of impactful moments. Like, I can remember, like, you know how with all the movies that you watched a bunch of times as a kid and your favorite movies, you can recite the most impactful scenes, right? Like, Luke, I am your father, and all these things like that. So if you watch really cool, impactful media in your target language, you're going to be remembering those scenes and remembering the language used in those scenes. And through that, remembering correct structures and vocabulary in your target language. So I'd say watch really good content in your target language. So let's see. Time has been flying. Didn't get to nearly as many questions as I would have hoped, but let me see. Try to get through a couple more. Thomas Donovan asks, how did you go about learning the Japanese counters? Do you have any resources you can recommend specifically for this topic? I just picked them up as I went through immersion. Like, it's easy to tell when something is a counter because it's just this because it comes right after a number, right? Like if you have a Japanese sentence like, oh, there's 3 pencils, and after the word 3, there's like this word you don't know. It's probably a counter, right? So telling when something is a counter is not hard. And all you have to do is look it up in the monolingual dictionary or the bilingual dictionary, and it will tell you like, oh, this word is a counter and it's used for these type of objects. So whenever that would happen, I would just make a card and learn that one counter. So I just learned counters as they actually came up in my immersion. And before I knew all the common counters because they had all come up at least once in my immersion. So I don't see any reason why you would have to study counters specifically outside of context. Like, I don't see why you'd have to go to some JapaneseCounters.com and just memorize them all in a row or anything like that, because you can just pick it up in your immersion. And in fact, I think it's better to do it that way, because if you just went to JapaneseCounters.com and try to memorize them all, you're going to have a lot of memory interference because you're going to be memorizing a lot of similar information in a very short time span. And what this does is leads to memory interference, right? When you memorize 2 things that are very similar to each other at the same time, a lot of times they get tied up together in your brain, and then you will start to confuse which one was which. And so I think that's what would happen if you try to just memorize all the counters at once. But if you learn them gradually over time through having them come up in your immersion, then confusing them is never going to matter. And of course, just making one SRS card for a counter won't be enough for you to intuitively understand exactly what types of things that counter is used for. But over time, through getting tons of immersion, you'll just get a more and more intuitive grasp of how the counters work and stuff like that. And if you're worried about how the numbers work, how it's ippun, nifun, sampun, and stuff like that, how sometimes when a counter attaches to a number, the readings of the number portion will change, and sometimes things can change. That I just picked up through immersion. I would just learn that, for example, fun is the counter for minutes, and then I would just know okay, I don't know exactly which pronunciation is going to be which at the present moment, but through immersion I'll eventually learn it. And eventually you just hear ippun, nifun, sampun so much that it's just, you just pick it up and you just know what it is intuitively. And that is what I would recommend doing, because it's the most practical way to be able to use it in real life when it counts. So let me see, I guess one more. So Caleb Lagan asks, hey Matt, when it comes to verb conjugation, for reference, my target language is French, should I make a different sentence card for each conjugation of the verb? Or will one card with one specific version of the word suffice? If I should make one card, should I be putting information about conjugations for irregular verbs on there? Or will immersion alone make the different verb forms feel like second nature? Basically, do I have to put any extra effort into the different forms that words can take, especially for irregular verbs? Okay, so the thing that you have to keep in mind is that your first goal in language acquisition is to become able to understand your target language. And the whole reason you're making cards is to help you achieve that aim of understanding the language. So the real question is, when you're learning a word, let's just say you have this word A, and word A has multiple forms. So the question you have to ask yourself is, if I memorize one form of word A, when I come across the different forms of word A in my immersion, will I still understand them? If the answer is yes, or even probably yes, then you only need one card. Because why make 5 cards to understand all the different forms when one card would be enough for you to understand the different forms? So the mistake here people make is they're thinking about the SRS as a tool to help them produce the language. So they're like, okay, well, if I don't memorize all 5 forms, I won't be able to use the 5 forms. But the thing is, that's not what we're worried about here. We're worried about understanding. Your first goal is understand the target language, understand a lot of your input, and through understanding a lot of your input, you'll get an intuition for what is correct and how to do it properly yourself. So a lot of times recognition is much easier than production. So a lot of times, even if a word has 5 forms, again, that's just an arbitrary number. I don't know the details of French, but if a word has 5 forms, just arbitrarily, a lot of times, if you just are familiar enough with how the language works in general, knowing one of those forms or knowing the dictionary form of that word will be enough for you to recognize the word when it's in other forms. Even if you couldn't produce it yourself, you'll be able to recognize it. And if that's the case, you only need 1 card. If it's not the case, because it's so irregular that if it was in a different form, you might totally realize, like, not be able to tell that it's that word, then you would want to make another card for that word. So basically, the question that you just have to be asking yourself is, what am I going to be able to understand when it comes up in my immersion? Make as many cards as you need to understand what is happening when things come up, but no more than that. And I would say that if a verb is not irregular, then you probably are just almost never going to need multiple cards, because if the way that it conjugates is systematic, then assuming that you know that system of conjugation, then knowing a verb in one form means you're going to know it in every form. When it comes to irregular verbs, then it gets more tricky because I don't know how irregular they are. If it's so irregular that it's unrecognizable when it's in a different form, then like I said, that would interfere with your ability to understand it when you come across it and would warrant making a new card just for that form. But that's pretty much as I can say without knowing more about French in particular, but hopefully that answers your question. So yeah, there were lots of good questions this week. Like I said at the beginning, I wish I could have got 2 more, but I like to take my time answering. And in the past, you guys have told me that you like when I take my time answering questions. So make sure you repost your questions on the bottom of this post. I'll get to them in the future. And stay safe, keep immersing, and I'll see you guys in the next one.